Keir Starmer can bluster at the dispatch box to his heart's content. But the fact is that grievance politicians like Nigel Farage would not have been able to stir up unrest after the murder of Henry Novak if the authorities had learned the correct lessons from previous mistakes. Mr. Novak, 18, was stabbed 5 times by 23-year-old Sikh Vikram Digwa as he walked home through Southampton after a night out with his football team on December 3, 2025. When police arrived at the scene, Digwa falsely alleged that Novak had racially abused him and knocked his turban off, and this prompted them to handcuff Novak. They only realised he had been stabbed and that the wounds were fatal after having done this. In a social media statement on Tuesday, June 2nd, 2026, Farage called for the public to respond with, and I quote, "pure cold rage," saying body cam footage of Novak's treatment showed that the rights of minority ethnic Britons were prioritised over those of white citizens. Speaking during Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday, June the 3rd, Farage added that the incident was the result of two-tier policing, citing anti-racism guidance issued to police. Whether provoked by his words or not, 11 police officers and a police dog were injured on Tuesday evening after crowds, including far-right agitators, attacked them in Southampton. The incident, apparently in protest about Novak's death and his treatment by police, has been described as a riot. There is reason to question the actions of the police. Authorities in Rotherham and other northern towns were found to have been reluctant to act against predominantly Pakistani paedophile grooming gangs for fear of being accused of racism, and lessons should have been learned from this, but they clearly weren't. This institutional failure to learn the correct lessons from the grooming gang scandals is at the root of what has happened here. The key point, though, is that there were always 2 lessons to learn from those scandals. The first was obvious. Authorities must never avoid enforcing the law because they fear accusations of racism. Multiple inquiries and reviews into grooming gang cases found that concern about community tensions and reputational risk did sometimes inhibit action. That was reported in places including Rotherham, Rochdale and Huddersfield. The second lesson was equally important though. Once public trust collapses, the far right will exploit institutional cowardice to push racial grievance and collective blame. It is entirely reasonable to ask whether institutional anxiety about racism influenced the decisions of police in Southampton on December 3 last year. The National Police Chiefs Council is reviewing its anti-racism guidance in what is effectively an admission that its language gives the wrong impression, as described by Policing Minister Sarah Jones, and public confidence has been damaged. But the words of Farage and others have escalated from asking a legitimate question into something far more dangerous. There is a huge difference between saying police must not allow fear of racism accusations to distort operational judgment and saying the UK now has 2-tier policing where minorities are privileged over white people. The first is a criticism of institutional behaviour. The second is an ethnic grievance narrative. If the state appears hesitant or evasive about obvious mistakes, people become more susceptible to the grievance narrative, and that is exactly why institutional failures are so politically explosive. Authorities tend to think they are reducing racial tension by being cautious, but the reality is that they can end up fueling far greater tension later, because the public concludes that obvious truths are being suppressed. That is what happened with the grooming gang scandals. Authorities knew, but they hesitated because they feared being accused of racism more than they felt a duty to properly investigate the crimes. Once members of the public believe this is normal operating procedure, every later failure gets interpreted through the same lens, and that is what we have seen in Southampton. Farage can claim he is highlighting a legitimate concern, but others may counter that exploiting a murder to incite rage is reckless. The moment politicians start framing crimes primarily as evidence of ethnic hierarchy, they stop trying to solve institutional problems and start mobilizing tribal anger. That is the central lesson here. If the police made decisions influenced by ideological training, public messaging, or fear of reputational consequences, then that has to be confronted honestly and corrected openly. Otherwise, every future mistake will feed the same cycle of distrust, anger, and violence.